We have two papers in the session mainly. One is by Dr. Madhan Mohan Jaganathan from JNU and Dr. Ranjit Krishnan from Department of English, NSS College, Vandam. So before we start with, I have gone through the titles of these two papers. First one is titled, What is Wrong with Social Order? A clarion call for an inclusive pursuit of social justice, which is by Madhan Mohan Jaganathan. He is, as I already told you, he is a professor from Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is trained in physics, political science, and international politics. He has presented various papers. One at British International, British International Studies Association Annual Conference, London, in 2019, which is titled, which has a very interesting title, I think, Still Missing the Voices of Marginalized in Tamil Nadu. He is a research supervisor, currently supervising 11 PhD candidates and 3 MPhil students. He has quite a lot of work experience, and I think his paper will add to our knowledge about this topic. Sir, can we start?
Should I start?
Yeah, sure, sir.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
So many thanks for the very kind words of introduction and appreciation therein. I wish to thank God Almighty for making this seminar presentation possible. I would like to convey my sincere gratitude to the organizers of this conference for inviting me to present a paper or a lecture which is titled, quote, What is Wrong with the Social Order? A clarion call for an inclusive pursuit of social justice, unquote. I'd like to convey my gratitude, thanks also to members of faculty at Mahatma Gandhi College, I would also like to convey my special thanks to Dr. Shibu MP, who was one of my first PhD students. The other first batch of PhD student was also from Kerala. And Dr. Shibu is now a member of the faculty, and I think happens to be the seminar coordinator. So good morning to everyone. Now, the title of the lecture is, as I mentioned, quote, What is Wrong with the Social Order? A clarion call for an inclusive pursuit of social justice, unquote. Why has the pursuit of social justice not been entirely successful despite a reasonable or a firm or a robust commitment by the Indian state towards the same? So this lecture grapples with this research puzzle, and it makes a modest attempt to unravel the puzzle. Now, towards this end, which is to unravel the puzzle, which has to do with the persistence of social injustice, I come up with the following propositions. The first one, the social order, despite the emergence and sustenance of social movements in various parts of the country, continues to remain hierarchical, exclusionary, and discriminatory. The second proposition, and all these propositions, mind you, are interlinked, interconnected. The second proposition is that an exclusionary social order, by way of, say, the persistence of the caste system, poses a most significant obstacle towards a pursuit of social justice. Proposition 3, the pervasiveness of the caste system, which is manifest, amongst other things, in the prevalence of untouchability, explains the patterns of everyday violence which is being inflicted on the marginalized communities of India. The fourth proposition is, despite the constitutional and legal prohibition on the practice of untouchability, the practice of untouchability continues to be prevalent in certain pockets and practiced in different forms. It seems that untouchability has not stopped, but it seems to have become more refined, more sophisticated, more subtle, more nuanced in different parts of the country. The question is, for those who contest this proposition, the question is, from which standpoint, from which vantage point is the reality being looked at? We'll come to that little later. The fifth proposition is that the discursive domain, the domain of ideas, not the material domain, is not adequately represented by various sections of society. In other words, exclusion and underrepresentation of the marginalized communities in various spheres, be it politics, civil society, such as media, higher education, the so-called intelligentsia, cinema. This underrepresentation results in a skewed discourses and partial narratives. The narratives are dominant narratives, but exclusionary narratives. The political attempt, and this is proposition 6, the political attempt to represent the marginalized communities by way of affirmative action, in the Indian context, call it as reservation, although well-intentioned, is perhaps a necessary condition, yet not a sufficient condition for achieving substantive social justice. So affirmative action, reservation is necessary, but reservation per se will not lead to the attainment of social justice. The seventh proposition, if politics, what is politics? International relations as a discipline is notorious for being regressive. Politics is not merely about the struggle for power. Politics is also about the quest for justice. But if politics is about who gets what, when, and how, we as a society seem to be staring at the reality of exclusion. And we have miles to go before inclusive politics becomes a slice of reality. Eighth proposition, at the heart of the problem is the perpetuation of the self-other divide, which is a kind of a binary which feminists, including critical theorists, mount a critique on. So this self-other divide is exemplified in the glorification of the self and the dehumanization of the other. The other may be a different caste, the other could be a different class, the other could be a different gender, the other could come from a different region or a religion, or the other could just be a different sovereign state. And this tendency has profound adverse implications. Methodologically, what David Singer would call it as Ptolemaic parochialism. As a problem of concern, again in methodological terms, methodological nationalism. So what is required is the embracing of the other and the breaking down of the self-other divide. We need to reach a stage where we need to privilege the other over the self to such an extent that the self-other binary breaks down, leading to harmony in society. The self-other divide is most conspicuous in the prevalence and the practice of the caste system. There is nothing as violent or more violent than the caste system. The caste system, by definition, is tantamount to violence. The ninth proposition, the notion of emancipation, which is critiqued both within mainstream and also by anti-foundationalist critical theorists. Now, I have this point to make about emancipation. What is emancipation? You could go to and quote Ken Booth, or you could invoke Dr. Ambedkar. The point that I wish to make is that emancipation, if it is sectional, if it is partial, may be counterproductive. We need to conceive of a notion of emancipation, an indigenous conceptualization of emancipation, which is more holistic. What Professor Andrew Linklater would consider as the emancipation of the species. And in this regard, it is apt to quote what the current DMK government in Tamil Nadu, headed by Mr. M.K. Stalin, reiterates, quote, "Ellorukkum ellam," unquote. In English, quote, "Everything is for everyone," unquote. Now, to add to these 9 propositions, let me move on to the 10th proposition. And this has to do with the tendency to romanticize rigidities, to rationalize barriers, to justify divisions under the pretext of traditions, customs, and conventions. Now, this tendency perpetuates discrimination and is tantamount to inflicting harm and violence. So, in this regard, public spaces, if you want to call it as places, ought to be made accessible to everyone except for medical or scientific reasons. In this regard, and still we are in proposition 9, I wish to reiterate the contribution of leaders such as Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, Mahatma Gandhi, Periyar E.V. Ramaswamy, Narayana Guru, Mr. C.N. Annadurai, and Mr. M. Karnanidhi, amongst others. The next proposition is this. which is that the policy formulation and execution relating to issues such as social justice ought to be bottom up rather than top down. And herein, the former Prime Minister of India, Mr. VP Singh, amongst other leaders, used to emphasize a need for the participation of people in the decision-making process. This is what makes a merely procedural democracy substantive. To quote Professor Rajiv Bhargava, one person, one vote, that is procedural democracy. This democracy is no good. Do we as a people participate in the decision-making process of the country? That is a question. Now, just to add further, let me say that this paper, this lecture, which is a work in progress, is primarily anchored in critical theory. Now, critical theory, the USP of critical theory, the defining characteristic of critical theory, is not to accept. No uncritical acceptance. No uncritical acceptance of hierarchy. No uncritical acceptance of discrimination. No uncritical acceptance of regimentation. No uncritical acceptance of injustice. But critical theory is pregnant with a discursive revolt to question social injustice, to question political injustice, to question economic injustice in the form of inequality. So critical theory makes a case for change. It doesn't bother about sustaining the status quo. To quote Karl Marx, quote, philosophers have interpreted the world in many ways, but the point, however, is to change it, unquote. So this is the change that critical theory is inclined towards. And this is the kind of change that Professor Andrew Linklater mentions. And this is the change that social and political thinkers and leaders, especially in this part of the world, in this country, including Dr. Ambedkar, including Mahatma Gandhi, the luminaries of the Dravida movement, Narayana Guru and others, they emphasize upon. So that is how this paper is anchored theoretically in critical theory. We now have critical problem solving theory, for instance. The proponent of this theory being Professor Chris Brown. We need to figure out whether that has relevance. What is critical problem solving theory? The perspective from the standpoint of the marginalized in real world situations. Now, methodologically, this lecture is anchored in critical social science, which is a subcategory of post-positivist methodological tradition. And when we get grounded in critical social science, positionality matters, reflexivity matters. So this lecture doesn't emanate from a mere bookish engagement, but from experiences, which is what positionality and reflexivity emphasize upon. The experience of suffering that I have encountered, the experience of suffering, discrimination that marginalized communities seem to have been encountering, And there seems to be light at the end of the tunnel. There seems to have been social churning, but this needs to be further accelerated and deepened. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. It was a wonderful paper. As I was listening to the paper, what I felt was the paper delves deep into the pervasive influence of caste system. It examines the political and the cultural impact. It highlights the key propositions. The paper was very systematic because as he was speaking about the different prepositions that would actually bring forward this idea, that was really a systematic kind of a thing, which helped us to get a grasp of the whole thing. Because I am from the literature stream. Now these are days of interdisciplinary kind of time. So I think this was a very wonderful paper, which helped us to understand a whole lot about social justice, how to address the self-other divide kind of policies. And you were also trying to delve deep into the how romanticizing rigid caste ties and emphasizing that nothing is more violence than going through these kinds of times. And another thing which I felt very attracted to was you said it was not mere bookish engagement, but it was a result of the experiences, which is really a wonderful kind of a thing. So only when things evolve out of experiences, I have always felt it comes out, or it has a ray of hope. It has something to do with the social reality. So that was really a wonderful part of the paper. And I think it was quite thought-provoking. So if the audience have any questions, you can ask, sir. If you have any questions, you can unmute your mic and ask him. So I have a question to address. You said this is actually theoretically rooted in the critical theory, which will help to change the situation. Do you think the critical problem solving theory will actually work in this instance? That was the content of your paper, but then can you cite any experience which has actually helped this purpose?
Okay, thank you very much for that very pertinent question. So I think the difference between critical theory and problem-solving theory, nothing original in what I'm saying, but the key difference is, whereas problem-solving theory, and this is stated by Ken Booth, seeks to bring about change within the system, but not changing the system.
Yeah.
They are trying to solve within the system, within the contours of the system, whereas critical theory would try to change the very system. Now, the difference also can be seen, I've written somewhere, say, in the difference of opinion between Gandhi and Ambedkar on the issue of separate electorates. So Gandhi was not in favor of separate electorates. Dr. Ambedkar was in favor of separate electorates. The British Raj also was in favor of listening to the voice of Dr. Ambedkar. But Dr. Ambedkar somehow felt that within the system, it will be difficult to achieve social justice. So he made a case for separate electorates. Eventually, call it as a power of the narrative or the politics, Gandhi prevailed, and that explains Pune Pact. So now critical problem solving theory seeks to strike a balance between critical theory and problem solving theory. So it doesn't seek to change the system entirely, but within the existing system, within the status quo, Is it possible to figure out a perspective from the standpoint of the marginalized? So I think the most important takeaway, we all agree to disagree, we have different opinions, but from whose standpoint, from whose vantage point, from whose real life experience are we in fact expressing our opinion in the form of knowledge? So as I think the chair rightly pointed out, and many thanks for those very kind words of appreciation about the lecture, I would consider more than anything else, experience is what makes knowledge authentic, legitimate, credible. So the experience of Gandhi, the experience of Dr. Ambedkar, the experience of Narayana Guru, the experience of Periyar, the experience of Karunanidhi. So, and it's no longer about books. So, how many of us, I mean, many of us have encountered a scenario wherein we are not asked to sit when we go to some places. So untouchability, hierarchies is all way too subtle. Exclusion is way too subtle. So I think this has been captured very well in a movie, in a Tamil movie, Ma Mannan, where Udayanidhi Stalin has played the role. His father being a Dalit within a mainstream political party, he has never been asked to sit. Although that his father, I mean, in that movie, is actually an MLA. So, and then you can actually relate to the point that Dr. Ambedkar makes for separate electorates. So I would stop here. So just thank you very much again.
Yeah.